you're going to need to find somebody to advocate for you, to protect your work, to uphold your legacy. And that's what we're talking about this evening. So this is really an opportunity to gain some insight and understanding on what a literary executor does, if they might be appropriate, someone like that might be appropriate for your estate, to understand the responsibilities and the impact that the person that you select has on the legacy of the work. So we're very, very honored tonight to have Joy Gresham with us. She is the successor executor to the estate of Lorraine Hansberry and the literary trustee. As such, she oversees the multimedia licensing of Hansberry's works and other intellectual properties in she was a consulting producer for stage productions in the US and abroad, and serves as the editor for print editions and Hansberry's writings. She's also an associate producer of the 2014 Tony Award nominated, oh no, not nominated, Tony Award winning Broadway revival of Raisin in the Sun, starring Denzel Washington. And she was the consulting producer with the Oregon Shakespeare Festival for a 2014 restoration production of The Sign in Sidney Burstein's Window. And she also served as, and continues to serve in all these capacities, also as a script consultant for various productions at the Goodman and National Theatre in London. Her career spans 40 years as a dancer, choreographer, college professor in the arts, education, and African American studies. So not a bad person to have as your literary executor. Now, sitting with her today is our two-time Pulitzer Prize winning playwright, Lynn Nottage. She is one of the most important voices in the American theater this century. Her plays have been produced all over the US and the world. Notable works include Sweat, won a Pulitzer, Obie, Susan Smith Blackburn Prize, Tony nomination, Ruined, Pulitzer Prize, Obie, Lucille Ortel, goes on, Intimate Apparel, many, many more, full of awards. She also happens to be on the board of DG Copyright Management, so she's very dear to us as well, and we are very lucky to have her with us today. Lynn, I will pass the mic to you.
And thank you for that introduction, and welcome everyone. I'm really delighted to be in dialogue with you, Joy, and really thankful to the Trust because I'm currently part of the Lorraine Hansberry Initiative, which is commissioning a statue of Lorraine by the wonderful artist Alison Sarr, which is going to tour the country in a year or so from now. And we're also creating a scholarship in Lorraine's name that will support women and non-binary dramatic writers attending graduate school. And so thank you to the Trust for supporting this initiative and being our cheerleaders. And as many of you know, at 29, Lorraine Hansberry was the first Black woman to have a play produced on Broadway, which was A Raisin in the Sun, which left an indelible mark on American theater and really reshaped the notion of who could be center stage. And many of us like to say she was the first intersectional artist before the word was even coined. And so, Joy, to start us off, I'm really curious about when you first encountered Lorraine Hansberry's work.
Well, thank you, Lynn. I'm really so excited to be part of this conversation. And I'm especially excited because it gives me an opportunity to talk about something that I seriously think about every single day that I come into my office. And that is, how can I enliven and engage Lorraine's legacy today? I'm kind of crazy and nerdy and imaginative, and I dream into that question because it's important to me. It's important work. It's an important question and challenge. So I'm really excited to just talk about that with you today. Lorraine and I met, so to speak. Our lives came together in 1967, when my mother, Jewel Gresham, married Robert Nimiroff, Lorraine's ex-husband and literary executor. And I was her only child, and we moved into Lorraine Hansberry's Croton-on-Hudson home where Bob lived. And that's where I met my muse. That's where I met Lorraine, so to speak. the house was just full of her spirit, and I grew up in this incredible space that was where she wrote and where she sought sanctuary and where she collected all of her art and her inspiration. And so I had the opportunity. This was 2 years after Lorraine died, and my mother, Jewel Gresham, was a writer too, and the house was really a writer's studio. It was filled with books, and every room of the house had, including the bathrooms, had filing cabinets full of Lorraine's materials, her notebooks, her manuscripts, her little canvases of art, her photographs, all kinds of things. And it was this incredible environment. And I guess the main thing that plays into our conversation tonight is that I had the opportunity to watch my father, Bob Nimiroff, build the legacy, build a really, I think of him sort of as the architect of the Hansberry legacy. And he created a vision, which I think is the ground on which we stand and how we come to understand and see Lorraine now. And so I had the opportunity to see his work, see him work, come to understand what an enormous undertaking that was on so many levels, how that drew from in him, within him. And it began to inspire me, so that now I really think of him as the person who I call my mentor, and that he really taught me by example what it is to be a literary executor, and how you make decisions, and his particular style was as champion, as protector, as the one who would fight against the tide, to make sure that she was seen and she was heard, at a time that was continually difficult. I mean, there was just it was a pretty exclusive scene. And in many ways, I think it continues to be so. But he was really responsible for, I think, making a way, creating a way so that she had a seat at the table in the canon. She was, as I said, seen and heard. So it was through him that I was introduced to her. And I consider her, I mentioned that I consider her my muse. I consider her my muse, but I grew up in an environment that was literally saturated by her presence. And I knew from, at the time I was 11 years old, as I was growing up, that I wanted to become part of her. I wanted to, I fell in love with her, and I decided that I really wanted to learn all I could about her. And that's where my preparation started.
Yeah, that's how wonderful that you got to grow up completely immersed in Lorraine's world, and you have an absolutely amazing job, an enviable job. And I'm wondering, as an executor right now, how do you go about shaping her legacy, particularly because the role has to continue to evolve with the advent of digital media and the new ways in which people are receiving art?
Yeah, I think one of the two of the important pivotal points in Lorraine's legacy was, first of all, in the 80s, when there was a move to include her play, A Raisin in the Sun, in the high school and college curriculum. And I think that made all the difference in the world, because that paved the way for an entire generation to be introduced to her and recognized as part of the canon.
Yeah.
And so that was an extraordinary thing. I think it was especially powerful because children claimed Lorraine. They were drawn to not only A Raisin in the Sun, but drawn to her as a kind of iconoclastic presence. She's kind of a Peter Pan figure in that she really is kind of eternally young, as we remember her as this young, fiery, confident, articulate voice and presence. And
Yeah, I mean, it's
I think it
interesting.
just had an incredible influence, on a broad cultural level. The second thing that happened that really was pivotal was in 2000, my mother, as part of her stint as successor literary executor after my father died in 1991, she deposited the papers, all of Lorraine's papers, to the Schomburg Center in Harlem, New York Public Library. And that was an extraordinary moment because the public finally had access to her papers. And it's an extraordinary collection of scripts, writings, essays, journalism, notebooks, journals, a wide array of writings. And it was an opportunity it provided so much evidence of this intersectionality in her living. One of the first things I did as successor executor was to coin a phrase that we use in our website, lhlt.org, which is that Lorraine is a artist, activist, public intellectual, and writer. And that's the full range of all the things that she was doing all at once. And it gives you an opportunity to understand her that much better when you go and you see her archives, and you get to understand that she was equally committed to these different modalities in her creative practice, and that it's really hard. It was very hard for her, and really not even an issue, to sort them into any kind of hierarchy or order. That for her, very much there was continuity between living in all those spaces at once.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I came to know Lorraine, certainly as most of us did, through A Raisin in the Sun, and it's only as an adult that I really came to understand the incredible vibrancy of her life,
Yeah.
as a social activist, as a political activist, as a member of the
Mhm.
LGBTQ community, and someone who was
Mhm.
just so outspoken, and who really not only wrote about social and cultural things, but she really lived it
Yeah.
thoroughly. And I'm curious, can anyone go to the Schomburg and access her papers, or is this something that you, as the executor, have to give folks permission to do?
The papers are located in the rare books and manuscript department at the Schomburg, and anyone can go there. You because it handles rare materials, you go there by appointment. And there are strict protocols in terms of handling the materials because you're you're there with 40 boxes that are brought out to you one at a time as you require, as you request them. And it's an extraordinary experience if you haven't worked with, rare books or someone's personal collection. But it's lovingly and professionally handled by the staff in that department. And there's a lot of guidance to help you. There's an incredible finder's guide that helps you navigate, that's very detailed. And there's a tremendous amount that you can see. There's some materials that are restricted, and there's a small, it's becoming, I'm trying to stay abreast of it because we're releasing materials, but for the most part, at this point, things are restricted in terms of some of her private writings and some of her unpublished works. They're restricted, and that requires my permission. But I'm very involved, and I'm a very engaged advocate of trying to promote people's work and people's exposure to it. And I really encourage, if first of all, I thrive on hearing the work that people are doing. So I love to hear people's projects. And, I work with a range of things, from books, the biographies that have recently come out, to teachers and graduate students who are just trying to develop some kind of thesis.
Yeah, there continues to be this incredible interest in Lorraine's life.
Incredible.
There are a number of recent biographies that have come out, and I think that there are a few that are forthcoming. And I guess this will allow me to segue into just what is your role as an executor in terms of shaping how these biographers craft their narratives around Lorraine's life, and who gets to tell the stories.
That's a great question. I think part of what was central and guiding for my father, Bob Nemiroff, was during his time as literary executor, he was very hopeful and very encouraging to those people who were interested in writing biographies of Lorraine, about Lorraine. But he was very cognizant and adamant about the belief that that person should be an African-American female. And he believed that the only way to really fully understand and engage Lorraine's legacy at the time, and we're talking about the late 1960s into the 70s, was from someone who could really see her in this intersectional mode, could really understand just the center of her brilliance and the center of her unique vision and perspective. And so a lot of time, much of his time was spent organizing all of her writings. He was kind of a natural archivist and curator, and had these just incredible natural skills when it came to notating things, collecting things, collected everything. And this was true when Lorraine was alive too. And so by the time Lorraine died, he was really the keeper of so much. He organized things and just had the skills for conservation and preservation. And so a lot of the material was collected and ready for the biographer that he chose, who a woman by the name of Margaret Wilkerson, who began work and worked very closely with him, because at the time, until 2000, all of Lorraine's papers were held in the Croton-on-Hudson home. And it was just, you know, as anyone who's listening can imagine, who has collected all their works around them, that it was just a tremendous, you know, it was a source of anxiety. It was just a tremendous responsibility to hold all this material. But it was so much easier to pass it on and to give access to Margaret when this material was already organized and ready, you know, and ready to be utilized. And so she worked very closely with him up until his death in 1991 to navigate these materials, as well as to receive all of the oral history through him of what so much of it meant, and what Lorraine intended for it. And so that's sort of like how it happened. Right. But to come back to your question, I think for me, the real thrust of what I'm responding to in your question is that, you know, this thing of like, who gets to do it? He believed that telling the story accurately and truthfully in terms of what Lorraine went up against. I mean, in order to understand Lorraine's brilliance, you really have to understand how smart she was, how articulate she was, how skilled she was, and more than anything, how engaged she was in activism and in, you know, the movements, to the extent that she drew on her experience as a journalist. She drew on her experience as an activist to write these plays like A Raisin in the Sun, but more importantly, like Les Blancs, which talked about, you know, colonialism and African territories, and, you know, just helped us to really understand the nature of activism and opposition to these regimes that she critiqued. And so it really required someone who could talk less about personality and more about what equipped her and made her who she was. And so Margaret came along and the book began. What happened when I came to the helm as successor literary executor after my mother passed away was that I felt that this was 2005. I felt that there was, I mean, this was an inner need in me to have Lorraine understood as an artist activist, to have her understood as having a a humanistic vision that was the source for her. And so I felt that it was really important that people understand who Lorraine Hansberry was.
Right.
And at that point, I know there were a number of people who were beginning to contact me about wanting to write biographies. And I decided that I was going to break a rule that my father and my mother held close to their hearts, which was anticipation of a singular biography about Lorraine Hansberry. I decided against that, to welcome any biographer's proposal
Right.
that sounded good.
Okay, so multiple perspectives.
Multiple perspectives.
So can I ask you a question? Because it seems you didn't know Lorraine, but you have an incredible intimacy with Lorraine, based on your family connection, but also as an executor, it really is a form of collaboration because you're
Yes.
being asked to continue someone's journey.
Yes.
And in the case of Lorraine Hansberry, her journey was cut off when she was very, very young.
Yes.
And as a
Yes.
result, she had a number of works that were incomplete, like Les Blancs and The Sign in Sidney Brunstein's Window and
Yes.
a number of other works. And so I wonder, as the executor, how do you go about completing these works when people want to do them? Do you take on that responsibility or do you invite other writers to be in conversation with Lorraine?
Well, ooh, that's a stacked question for me. I mean, it requires a stacked answer. Let's see how to answer that. When I came on board as the literary trustee, successor, executor, I had an overwhelming bias that the world needed to know Lorraine past A Raisin in the Sun. I felt that it was time for the underrealized, underappreciated works of hers to be understood and experienced. So I wanted there to be time for people to get to know The Sign in Sidney Brunstein's Window, Les Blancs, as well as to be Young, Gifted, and Black, which is the autobiographical drama that my father adapted about Lorraine, as well as some of her unpublished work, which is some of which are published in a edition called Les Blancs and the Collected Plays. And so I just wanted people to see her full range. And so I was really encouraging the promotion of those works. And as time would have it, in 2009, the 50th anniversary of A Raisin in the Sun occurred. And there was tremendous celebration and commemoration of that milestone, as you can imagine. And at that time, I was contacted by the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, who, and this is kind of a typical call that I get. They were really interested in staging The Sign in Sidney Brunstein's Window. And the literary director was a woman who went to graduate school and did her thesis on the sign in Sidney Brustein's window. She thought it was like the best thing since sliced bread. She thought it was the most amazing play, her favorite. And I had to like sit on my hands because it's my favorite too. And I was just like over the moon because she was, you know, saying how important it was, how timely it was that this play be performed. And you have to understand, because Lorraine's window of production, playwriting was so short, you know, we're talking like a 10-year span, that all her plays were coming up for 50th anniversary within 2 years of one another, whatever, you know. So at that time, when all this attention and hoopla and celebration was going on around Raisin in the Sun, I was just so happy to hear someone talk about a major revival of the sign Sidney Brustein's window. And so I said that I thought this was great. I was really excited about it, that it was my favorite play too, but that, you know, I had a deal to propose, which was that I would like to do a major dramaturgical study of this particular play, because Lorraine had four or five different scripts that were divergent. They were really different from one another of the same play. And there were three or four different editions of the play, of the script that was published from the time of her death into the 60s, later 60s. And so I wanted to suggest that we look creatively at the range of materials and sort of get to the bottom of what was happening. And I had a private, what was happening for her, what her creative arc was, her process was. I had a private agenda, which I didn't speak to, but it was really the way in which I learned my job at the time. True, I had this deep connection with Lorraine, but I was always, when I was a young literary executive, I was always just one step in front of the next requester, you know, the next person who came and said, there's this work, or there's this essay she wrote, or this letter, and can I use it in this way? And usually you know, there was a broad body of work that I was familiar with, but there were some things and some processes of hers, creative points of developing the works, that I really knew nothing about. And so projects like this, any kind of investigation, any kind of collaboration with actors and directors was and is always an opportunity for me to go in and to listen to Lorraine, and to part of what you'll see if you go to the Schomburg was that Bob Nemiroff had incredible notes during Lorraine's lifetime, things that she dictated to him, things that she shared with him, conversations that they had, that he would collect. And he had collect letters, he had collect notebooks, workbooks. And so there's all kinds of materials that are a roadmap that help us to her intention.
And did Lorraine have a will? Did she lay out any roadmap of what she wanted for her archive?
No, she didn't. Lorraine basically left her intention was that all her materials, all her writing, be held in a literary trust. And Bob Nemiroff was the literary trustee, and the basically she had entrusted him in life and in her will to the work of organizing it, maintaining it, representing it. And I think they had a very close collaborative relationship where he was her sounding board. He had the opportunity to, he was a top-notch editor. So he had the opportunity to work with her on her writing. And she just had an enormous trust in him. And so he was given tremendous latitude to figure it out. And one of the things that happened, which is important to know about his stewardship, was that in 1967, the courts allowed him to have this dual capacity, both as executor, literary executor, and as an independent agent, so to speak, to purchase her literary estate.
So yeah, can you talk me through what that means?
It meant that her copyrights were I'm not exactly sure if they were forced to sell or I believe as part of settling her estate, they had to be sold.
Okay. And so the estate.
And Bob worked very, very hard to try and facilitate her family purchasing the literary estate. But they were not in a position to, or didn't feel, or didn't feel capable of that. And so it went, into that space where things go of this kind and are in real jeopardy.
Which, listening to you speak is all the more reason why a program like this one is necessary, because I think that there are a lot of writers out there who don't know
Who don't
where
know.
to, don't know where to direct their archive, or
Yes,
even
that's
don't
right.
even think about their archive until it's too late, and then it ends up in that liminal space, in that limbo, in which,
Absolutely.
there are people who they don't know making decisions
Right.
about it. And
That's
so
right.
it's really important, to either name an executor or to name some sort of organization that can curate and continue to protect your legacy.
That's correct. And of course, at this time, at 34, she wasn't thinking about these things. And and it was really, she wasn't really of the mind to think of these things. It really wasn't, it wasn't something that I think she would have been prepared for a long, long time. But I think what happened was that he, was on of that mindset. He had been thinking about these things. He had been handling some of the copyright matters, and knew that part of his role and his calling was to try to find a way to purchase this literary estate. And that's, it's sort of like by hook and crook and calling everybody he knew, he cobbled it together and was able to do it.
Can I ask you a question? Because I know, just as a writer, all of the incredibly bizarre requests that I get, including some today.
Yeah,
And and I'm kind of shocked by what people want to do with my text, for everything
yeah,
from, short. I had one request in which, for my play Ruin, they're wondering whether they could cut down a play that's 2.5 hours to 1 hour. I was like, no, you cannot. But I just wonder, how do you field those kinds of requests, and what are
yeah.
some of the more bizarre requests that you get for Lorraine? Because she is so iconic, not just as a writer, but as sort of a public
Yeah,
intellectual.
yeah, that's a great question. I was, I mean, the short answer to your question was that I was tremendously uh, protected and empowered by this rule that I grew up hearing, um, kind of hearing through the walls, my father on the phone in his office having these conversations, which were based on this rule that you never change Hansberry. You never adapt it. You never change the language. You never tweak it. It's like the words are intentional and you leave them alone. And he did everything he could to honor that and maintain that and govern that. And so in time, people just didn't ask. I mean, it was kind of understood that you don't change Hansberry, you leave it alone. You don't change your Raisin in the Sun, you leave it alone. That doesn't mean that occasionally some request that would come through that was off the wall, or it sounded off the wall, especially when there's that much order around things and you hear, you know, that the trend is to, with a Raisin in the Sun, is to think that it has this this universal applicability, and it can be staged in any language, anywhere, with any ethnicity, and it's this whole interpretation of universalism.
So
And
that's it.
Lorraine was not at all about that.
So you get a call from Kazakhstan and they want to do a Raisin in the Sun, and you know
Exactly.
that there aren't, really many Black people there. Do you
Exactly.
give them approval to do the production, or do you say find the 6 Black people in Kazakhstan to do it?
Well, for example, I'll talk about what I know. I had a request in the early 2000s from Australia to do a Raisin in the Sun, and they essentially wanted to do it in blackface. I mean, essentially, they wanted to just sort of like color up the actors so that they could do it. And it kind of tickled me at first. It was like, oh no, we're not going to do that. But the educator in me kind of came through and said, well, that doesn't really make sense. Let's think about this. And let's look at this from an Aboriginal point of view. And it's like, maybe there's a story here that's authentic and that's real, that can be can be thought of so that it's still a story about race, and you can still work with actors who can inhabit this, this cast and these roles. And they had absolutely they couldn't wrap their heads around that, and they essentially disappeared, because the negotiation just fizzled out. They
Yeah,
couldn't
it
couldn't
became
understand it.
too difficult to. I mean, I'm going to move to some of the questions now in the Q&A, and I'm just going to ask one of the questions because it's connected to what we were just talking about. And it's when people want to do parody of Raisin Sun, like the Colored Museum, does the estate step in, or, or do you not know about it until it's too late?
Um, that's a great question. The Colored Museum was staged on my father's watch when he was alive. It was staged, and he went to see it, and he really enjoyed it. He enjoyed the parody. He enjoyed seeing Lorraine's play in the world. I mean, there was something about it that he thought was important.
Right.
And more importantly, there was something about him and his role that was open to this interpretation. And that's, that's a story in itself, that part of him as literary executor, which I could talk long and hard about. But I think that was really what was happening. And at the same time, it created incredible chaos and confusion because of the nature of the parody and the fact that there were many people in the audience and in the world who were hurt by it, who couldn't laugh, who couldn't really understand that you don't do that to this, to this work. And so it created, I think this cultural, social phenomenon that was very interesting.
One of the questions that's come up is you had an obvious connection to Lorraine Hansberry, and they want advice on what you would do if you're managing a state that you don't really know the author that well.
That's hard. That's a hard question for me to answer. I would really have to think about that, because my whole identity and my whole vision and my whole method and my whole life experience is based on connection, and most importantly, working with someone who had a firsthand connection with her.
Right. Well,
and so it's hard to, but I will say that I think it's critical that that there is a real understanding of how the artist speaks of their work, a real deep effort to access that and to represent that alongside the work itself. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, I think that what you said is critical, is really to immerse themselves in all aspects of the artist's life, not just their primary writing, but the things that have been written about them. And
Yes.
if there are people who know them well, is perhaps, doing information interviews with those folks.
Yes.
The next question, someone wondered about the role that your father had in the script of LeBlanc's when it was produced at the Royal Court.
At the Royal Court, is
I guess
that
it's the most recent
they're talking
production.
about okay.
Yeah,
So the
it was at the
National,
National Theater, I think.
yeah,
It
the
was.
National Theater was part of a restored script. It was a restored script that I worked on. I was sort of the lead investigator of that dramaturgical team, and it was based on the same process that I described with the sign in Sidney Brustein's window, where we worked with all of her manuscripts. We worked with all of her notes. We worked with director's notes of, any major revivals or professional revivals, professional stagings where we had communications with the directors, just to understand how we have come over time to understand that work.
Right.
But the main thing I'm saying is that it was a restored script that I worked on, and it took my father's adaptation from the 70s and maintained it, but we worked in workshop with Yael Farber, the director, to try and investigate it.
I guess this segues into the next question. As someone asked, what do you think Lorraine would say regarding how the lives of BIPOC community has changed since 1965? I don't know that you can necessarily answer for her, but there's the question.
Um, Lorraine was a community-based artist. She was a community movement person. She really believed in communities. She really believed in community activism. And in the sense that she predates a lot of the major emerging movements of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, I think she would have been um, extraordinarily moved and proud and engaged in BIPOC, LGBTQ communities. She would have been involved. She would have been at the front. She would have been a very loud activist and advocate of the intersectionality within those communities, and the importance of listening and working together, of that collaboration, because she was most concerned about the conflict within than she was the conflict between communities. She was really concerned about how we undermine and ourselves, and we don't listen to ourselves within communities. So she would have been really excited about people forming community and doing the hard work.
We have time just for one last question. And so someone has asked, has Joy thought of who would inherit this role she now serves as the literary executor?
That's a hard one. Yeah, I think about it from time to time. I come from a very unique stewardship where Lorraine asked Bob Nimiroff to complete her work, to be the protector and the champion, and he made the greatest sacrifices to do that, and spent his adult life up until his death dedicating himself completely to that. Not only himself, but his family. I mean, my mother and I were all a part of that effort. When he died in 91, he asked that of my mother, and there wasn't a heartbeat, and she stepped into those shoes. My parents were of the generation that you live your life so that your children are more free. And so it was never intended that I was to do this. They worked really hard so that I would have I would have different choices. But something powerful happened. I guess three's a charm. And when it was my time, when my mother passed away, heartbeat didn't pass. And I dropped what I was doing and, used my whole skill set to step into these shoes. I'm sort of sharing what I didn't understand at the time, but I've come to understand it as a parent. I hope my children can be freer, have better choices, so that if they were to make this choice to follow this work, it would be with full commitment. And who knows, that may be the case, but I think that will be up to them, and those are conversations we're starting to think about.
It's just such an amazing thing, because the most important thing is that the legacy continues, and that we keep remembering and keep thinking and keep discussing. Lynn, Joy, thank you so much. This was really a beautiful conversation.
It was really
Appreciate
great.
your
Thank
time.
you, Joy.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Deborah.
everybody out there.